Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast with Zach Bitter. A few details about this podcast before we get started. Details about this podcast episode and more can be found at zachbitter.com. My website is where you can find all details about the podcast, including episode notes, links, timestamps, and a full transcript. You can also find my social media channels and newsletter sign up there. If you want to support the show and also gain access to an intro and ad-free audio version of every episode, as well as early release, consider joining the show Patreon page. You can also access my coaching services, which include my virtual group coaching package, products that I use, my Amazon storefront, which highlights a wide range of training and racing items that I use. Please consider sharing episodes you like on social media, liking, commenting, and writing a review. It really goes a long way in reaching new listeners. As a way to thank listeners who engage, I am raffling a 30-minute consultation with me every month for anyone who shares, leaves comments, and reviews the podcast. Just remember to tag me or send an email to hpopodcast@gmail.com to let me know if I'm not already tagged, so I can add you to the raffle. Also, if you have suggestions for show topics or guests, you can also send those to that email address as well. Finally, a big thanks to S-Fuels, John G, Delta G Ketones, and Element Electrolytes for sponsoring this podcast. Links and discounts to these brands can be found in the show notes as well as at zachbitter.com. I also left a more formal description of each of these brands at the end of the episode. All right, let's get into the show. Mikki, welcome to the show.
Zach, so great to be here. Thanks so much for asking me to come.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I actually feel a little embarrassed that I haven't had you on at this point because I think you add a lot of great information to kind of the topic we're going to hit on today, which is kind of the overreaching one of low carb endurance, but a lot of cool kind of subtopics within that are definitely worth unpacking.
Yeah, nice one. And no need to feel embarrassed at all, Zach. You are super busy with your running, your training, your coaching, and everything you put out there on X, of course, and in addition to, of course, Human Performance Outliers. So I'm just thrilled to have the chat now.
Awesome. Yeah, no, let's jump in. So we were chatting a little bit about this before I hit record too, is just, as long as like kind of low carb and ketogenic diets have now been sort of like in the news and have bled into a bunch of different categories, including endurance, it still seems like we struggle to sometimes to kind of come up with a definition that is, I don't want to say accurate because like that's probably the wrong way to say it, but just there tends to be a lot of I think this is probably natural actually to some degree where people want this very specific plug in no matter what type of definition. But as I know you've talked about a bunch of times in the past, is like it's sort of this moving target to some degree because we're talking about a physiological process at the end of the day, and lifestyle just plays such a big role when you're looking at like something like what I do with ultra marathons versus what someone may be doing like power strength sports are doing and things like that. So how do you approach people when they come to you and they say, hey, I want to try out this kind of low carbohydrate or ketogenic diet, or I'm interested in it, can you tell me more? Do you have like a go-to like set of like questions that you use to kind of dig into like what that would probably actually mean to them versus what other people might think?
Yeah, a great question, Zach. And I think you really hit the nail on the head when you said, it's about our physiology at the end of the day. And this is one of the first things that I love to chat to people about is that if we go, well, first of all, a ketogenic diet is quite different from like a low carb diet. But also even that a ketogenic diet is there to elicit a state of ketogenesis. So it is more about that carbohydrate depletion that for one person might require a diet that is 20 grams of carbohydrate or less in a day. But for someone who might be putting in a ton of training miles and actually utilizing their glycogen stores and depleting them on a daily basis, for that individual, it might even be, 150 grams of carbohydrate a day. So that there is no one prescription, I think, is probably one of the first things that we touch on. And then also the idea of how appropriate a ketogenic diet is for that individual. And now I'm a huge fan of a ketogenic diet from a therapeutic perspective, and we know how effective it is in a range of different areas, and also, of course, in the ultra endurance space too. Like it can be a really useful tool, but we always sort of want to just check that it is the most appropriate approach, because a lot of those benefits that come from a ketogenic diet or being in a lower carbohydrate state, where you can increase endurance adaptations, balance blood sugar, and improve body composition, can be done on a low carbohydrate approach or a carb appropriate approach, and not necessarily a ketogenic approach. So we just sort of like set the scene in terms of what the outcomes are that the athlete would want to sort of achieve, and then we talk about, okay, well, what's actually going to get them there.
Yeah, that's excellent. I like what you said there at the end too, because like the outcome they want to achieve is one where I'll a lot of times start with a client who's interested is like because some people will come to me and they're like, all right, I want this lifestyle for some particular goal that's not performance related versus
Yeah.
someone else who comes to me and they don't necessarily have any compelling health or dietary preference reason to do it, but they're like, hey, I'm just here for performance and think this may play a role here. Like, those are kinda 2 different approaches as far as I'm concerned too, because it's like, for somebody who found a pattern of eating that they really enjoy for just general health and just what works for them, and they're like, "Yeah, I wanna run well, but I don't necessarily need to eke out every last little percentage," then I may be a little less likely to start really kinda moving things around too much because I don't wanna derail their main priorities in the process versus the person who's all about performance with it. And then it's like, okay, well, maybe we have a little bit more of a kind of an open slate as to what that maybe would mean.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's worth acknowledging also that, I mean, I am certainly more of a low carbohydrate sort of practitioner. But of course, as we've just discussed, that can look very different. And essentially, it almost is better to just say I'm lower than what might the recommendations might be, because it is, if we think about it, the end of the day, the athlete, regardless of who they are, in order to perform at their best, they need to prioritize their health. And if an athlete is trying to hit carbohydrate requirements of, let's say, 8 to 12 grams per kg body weight, which is what you might see in sports nutrition textbooks, there's just no room to get other nutrients in that help support their overall goals. And I guess I learned quite early on in my practice that even though the sports nutrition guidelines would say that this is what we should be recommending our endurance athletes, it was almost like a secret thing that no one talked about, that, yeah, that's what they say, but no one ever can actually do that, because almost everyone that you would suggest to do that would start gaining body fat. And then, you'd have to think about uh, their micronutrient status, because there were just so many foods they couldn't eat because the carbohydrate requirements tended to be so high. And I think if you look at research around carbohydrate intake of even elite athletes, I believe that the average, unless it's been updated, might only be about, or up to about 5 grams per kg of body weight, even in those very elite athletes. So the, I guess, from a carbohydrate perspective, that's just like one element of it. But what other nutrients are super important to help with their overall goals as well, which are just so difficult to achieve if you're like pushing those numbers super high.
Mhm. Yeah, and I find this one interesting because when you see people like arguing about this topic, it always ends up kind of playing out to be like, oh, well, I'm gonna share the most like negative aspect or the weak link in that approach and kind of try to put that up on this big pedestal as like, Don't consider this because of this." And they're not really weighing that against what would be, what else would happen when you do that. So like what you said too, like if you're, and I guess this would apply to strict ketogenic diets as well, where you are removing a very big piece of what would typically be kind of a more like balanced around the macronutrient diet. And whenever you do that, you do run into some potential things to consider in terms of how are you going to get like those micronutrients and make sure that you're still on top of all of that so that the trade-off isn't net negative. And yeah, I think that's a really interesting way to maybe kind of like unpack some of that stuff at times, is like looking at it through that lens of, okay, well, be willing to accept the trade-off if it's gonna be a net positive, because everything's probably going to have some trade-off somewhere,
Mm.
and the more of those you're aware of, the better you're probably gonna be able to piece together what's actually gonna work for you versus, whatever the better person at debating is gonna convince you of.
Yeah, no, for sure. And if we think about like evidence-based practice, I always frame it up that we've got these like three um elements to it, if you like. And I believe I probably heard this first maybe 15 years ago from Chris Kresser. Do you know who I'm talking about with Chris
Yeah.
Kresser? Yeah. And
Mhm.
he was just such a reasonably he's just such a reasonable individual, I think. And he's like, look, there's this evolutionary base for some of the best recommendations. How have we evolved to optimize our health across thousands of years? And whilst it's not about everyone going back to live in a cave, it's taking some of this information and knowledge and how we can apply it in our everyday life when it comes to nutrition. And then, of course, you've got those randomized controlled trials that, like the science of nutrition, which allows us to understand more about what's going on and the mechanisms that are involved, but don't necessarily reflect what can be translated in real life, And I think that's a really important piece of what we look at with regards to sort of best practice and things like that in nutrition. And then, of course, you've got that individual in front of you, and you're in my clinical experience, but also what the person I'm talking to, like, what did they bring to the table in terms of their own experience? Because at the end of the day, everyone is quite different as to how they're going to respond to an approach, and that won't always be informed by our evolutionary basis or by what science tells us. And so always coming at things with an open mind, thinking, is this going to work, or what tweaks do we need to make, because that's a very real experience that person is having, which is sort of why I I I'm, I don't just dismiss anecdotes, I suppose, because there is, we are all anecdotes, aren't we? And I
Mhm.
just think it can add real value and tell us a lot, or tell that individual a lot about, what they're experiencing.
Yeah. No, and that makes sense. I think and that's another thing that I think sometimes gets confused too, because like if you're working with an individual, their anecdotes are important because
Mm,
it's like literally like what happened when you did this input versus like applying that to like a group of people that you don't know anything about yet. And that's where I sometimes think like a lot of the conversations can get a little messy is because it's like someone wants to apply their anecdote to a group, or a group that is the recommendations are working for want to apply that to someone who's already tried that, and they learn from their own personal anecdotes that that didn't work for them for one reason or the other, and they needed to pivot to something different. And then you sort of kind of get a little bit of like kind of like a different conversation going back and forth with those sort of things. But yeah, it's and at the end of the day too, it's like, anecdotes are usually what start a conversation and get people
mm.
interested in doing some of the more formal scientific work anyway. So if you just ignore them altogether, then you kind of miss out on some of those prompts that would maybe generate the curiosity in the first place.
Yeah, for sure. And when we are looking at scientific trials, what is always presented, or most often presented in the results, is like an average value of everyone's experience and everyone's response. And so there will always be a range within that. So for example, if you're looking at, performance outcomes on a lower carbohydrate diet, and there's and whatever the value is that they're looking at, this is the average value that people experienced. Well, there will always be that's like the average value. Yet the participants all have their own individual response that all sort of accumulate uh, to form part of that value. So I think understanding that also helps people recognize that there are just many different outcomes that someone can experience, regardless of what science sort of tells us, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, where do you fall within that average
Mm,
that average could get there from a couple extremes averaged together versus everyone ending in the same spot? Yeah, and that actually, like, made me think of, I'm sure you've, probably spoken about and dug into the study that came out earlier this year where they were looking at ketogenic endurance athletes and then they were comparing them to, the essentially the same group with a washout period on a high carb diet, and they they controlled energy intake to the degree where neither of the groups gained weight, so we sort of could rule out some of, like, the weight gain side of potential problematic outcomes that can kind of muddy the waters a little bit, and they found that, like, 3 out of the 10, uh, individuals in the study actually had, like, pre-diabetic levels when they
Mm,
were at weight maintenance on a moderate to high carbohydrate diet. And I was thinking to myself, it's like, well, that's really interesting because, like, most people would probably assume at, like, a calorie controlled diet or a weight maintenance diet, moderate to high carbohydrate, that person shouldn't have pre-diabetic levels of fasting blood glucose. But here we were, 3 of the 10 there. So there was either some sort of thing going on with those participants where within the context of endurance plus the carbohydrate required to maintain weight at, I think it was like 65% of their intake or somewhere around there,
mm.
they found themselves with a problem. And, all that went away when they switched to I think their ketogenic diet was around 50 grams of carbohydrates per day with that group. But, um, there was a lot of other things being looked at in that particular study too, but I thought that was maybe one of the more interesting pieces that came out of it, in terms of like what would maybe make someone a little more curious than just looking at like, oh, endurance athletes eat carbs, and that's just the way it is.
100%, Zach. And I think that study, and I believe it was a Prince study actually that you're referring to, and I think it really highlighted a few things in my mind. One is, well, the individuals you're thinking about, I think they were classed as middle aged. So, and if I
Mhm.
think about the vast people that I work with, and potentially you work with as well, where we're all sort of in this age group and probably ability level that isn't necessarily elite. So what we see elite athletes quote unquote get away with may not be so favorable in the sort of middle-aged uh, competitive yet still recreational athlete, which I think a lot of us would sort of fall into that category. And we didn't know what these individuals' blood sugars were like prior to the study either. So they may well have their diet. I can't recall actually what their usual baseline diet is like, but there were no measures of blood glucose in their everyday life. So this might have just been reflective of what the individuals were experiencing before coming into the study also. And then, you know, I mean, we often look at body size as a reflection of health. And whilst it certainly is one indicator in certain populations of how healthy an individual is, as an athlete, we can't use that as our determining factor because of all of these, because you can still have metabolic challenges and as a lean individual. And so sort of understanding that and being aware of that, I think is valuable because so many times we just think, oh, if we're like leaner or smaller, then we can sort of get away with eating the junk food that our training affords us, in terms of overall caloric balance and maintaining a body weight that would be considered healthy. But if you don't know what's going on under the hood, then I think that is certainly something that people need to be mindful of. Which, and I don't know actually how you feel about this, but I am actually quite a fan of slapping a glucose monitor on someone and just seeing how they respond in their everyday life to just not just the food that they eat, but the sleep that they get and the stress of the training and stuff like that. Because if we can uncover some of these metabolic challenges before they end up sort of becoming full-blown conditions, then you're actually doing a lot in that preventative health space and you're keeping someone healthy, which is ultimately what you would want.
Mhm. With continuous glucose monitors, I think they're great tools. I think they're definitely something that require a bit of upfront education for a
Mm.
person to kinda make the right it's gonna give you some information, right? And it's gonna not give you other information. So,
Yeah,
if you start kind of thinking about it through the lens of just that one piece, then you could run into problems, or if you look at it too acutely, uh where it's like you're freaking out about one glucose spike that kinda comes back down, and then that's driving all your decision making that could potentially make it, trying to solve a problem that's not really there. But a lot of
yeah.
that stuff can just be like I think, I mean, it's like any tool, right? It can be misused, and then you end up getting something that you weren't looking for out of it. But, yeah, when done right, I think, like, let's take that example of those 10 athletes where 3 of them had pre-diabetic levels of blood glucose. Something like that could help them tease some of that information out to find out,
Mm,
like, okay, well, was this just a one-time thing that was higher for one reason or another, like the stress of participating in a study or something like that.
yeah.
They're gonna know that with by wearing a continuous glucose monitor. Or let's say that they do find out that they are sitting high fasting blood glucose and they wanna try to remedy it. If they have the continuous glucose monitor on for a few weeks and they're kind of continuing that pattern that resulted in that, they can see what is actually moving the needle the most with that, and then start maybe, like, taking care of the bigger movers first versus trying to, like, overhaul things and guess at what's gonna work and what's not gonna work.
Yeah, completely. And there are like so many, if we just staying on that point, like there are so many things that people can do, both like just even small changes to their activity and diet that can make a really measurable difference in their overall blood sugar management, right? And it might be, if you're an endurance athlete and you do all of your training in the morning but are largely sedentary, then even making small shifts in your non-exercise activity can make big differences to your blood sugar. Raw apple cider vinegar before a meal can help lower that postprandial blood sugar response. Yeah, so you're right. Like there are plenty of things which you can trial when you've got it in front of you to make sure that, or to sort of get things back into line. But that's such a good point that you raised, that the education piece around how useful it is, but also how it fits in the context of everything else, because you can't just chase the lowest blood glucose level because other things will fall out of whack if that's your only sort of outcome that you're interested in.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting stuff. I'll be probably even more curious when we have monitors that literally give you, like, a full blood panel on a regular basis,
Yeah.
because then you do see the full picture and have that readout, and I think, I haven't seen anyone really that I know and talk to them specifically, but I know they have continuous, ketone monitors now that
Yes.
I'm sure eventually will become more mainstream or something people can just get. But yeah, I mean that's like a step towards that direction. You kind of seeing like, see some of these other things that are going on along the way too, and then start kind of piecing that stuff together more holistically.
Yeah, I did like how you mentioned sort of the big pillars, and then if you step back, and I think this is where nutrition, it's very easy to sort of go down a rabbit hole in one particular area, and I suppose this is where the whole concept of like quote unquote sort of like biohacking sort of comes in with regards to nutrition and lifestyle and training and longevity and the rest of it, and it's very easy to ignore the real basics, which actually, for most people, if they just did the basics better, then they probably would, their overall outcomes would be more in line with what they're trying to achieve. And, we talk about low carb and we talk about low fat or high fat, and protein for a large number of years didn't even really feature in the conversation. And I feel like it's sort of getting much more limelight now than what it used to, and that's where I think most people and endurance athletes especially could probably um, not do better, but focus more on, and then it becomes less important. To my mind, the carbohydrate or the fat if you sort of dial in your protein requirements.
Mhm. Yeah, and a lot of times I think too, it's like and this can work both ways, but, like, protein sort of, like I mean, you can definitely go and find pure protein sources, especially if you're taking protein powders and things like that, but a lot of times if you're just grabbing foods that are high in protein, there's gonna be some fat that come along for the ride, or if you're seeking fat, you're not likely gonna unless you're taking oils and butters and, like, full creams and things like that, you're gonna get some protein along for the ride too, so I do wonder sometimes with especially with the low carbohydrate diets, it's like those 2 macronutrients pair quite frequently.
They do, for in my clinical experience, for men more than women, or for males more than females.
Mm,
And I wonder whether part of it is some of what we were discussing before we hit record is that um, females might. struggle more to get their protein in only because they're so used to taking things out of their diet. And this is a gross generalization, but you tell a woman to take carbs out of their diet, and they've been doing that since the 90s. That's no big deal to them. But getting the fat into their diet and lifting their calories up to an appropriate amount for training is somewhat harder. But also, in my experience, focusing more on protein tends to give them better outcomes with regards to recovery, with regards to appetite regulation, hormone balance, and things like that, rather than just solely focusing on being higher fat. And this is not every person, because obviously everyone's an individual, but that I think that protein piece for women maybe are more important to target, because, as you say, a lot of the higher fat foods may also deliver protein for our male athletes, and they might not find it difficult to hit protein as long as they're hitting the energy and the calories they need. Whereas women often are sort of like slightly lower in calories and maybe lower than what they should be, and then really struggling to get their protein in, and just a little bit confused about how the whole thing works.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, you raised a good point. It kind of leads us into like a topic I really wanted to dive into with you is just like women on low carb ketogenic diets. And just, there's a lot of, I would say like I would say like if we would just like ask the average person who's even like semi informed with nutrition about like low carb ketogenic diets, do they work better or worse for men or women? I think people would like intuitively think they work better for men for some
Mm.
reason. And I'm curious about that. Is that something like that we just need to study more? Is there something actually unique about females that would make them less likely to do well on a ketogenic diet? Or is it kind of like you said, there are some kind of maybe culturally motivating factors that are creating an environment where someone who, I guess like the way to maybe think about it would be like if, the average female who chooses to try a ketogenic diet or a low carbohydrate diet is more likely to underconsume from past experience and things like that versus you put a male on a ketogenic low carb diet, their first thought might not be restriction. It might be like, "Okay, we're just changing the inputs," and they may actually end up eating more potentially.
I think that's exactly it, Zach. So, I've had a number of discussions over the years with my good friend, Dr. Cliff Harvey, and he's, studied ketogenic diets. I think for his PhD, actually, this was like the topic of his PhD research, and he's dived into the literature, and I have as well. And what often happens is that when you is that the potential deficits that a woman might experience on a ketogenic diet or a low carbohydrate diet are hard to disentangle from that from of low calorie, actually. And even if you look at research, and research might state that low carbohydrate diets are negative for a woman's energy availability, or for her energy availability is the prime example. If you follow the lead in terms of that literature, often they are referencing papers that are in fact looking at low calorie and not low carbohydrate. And I think that is certainly something to be mindful of when you're looking at some of the critique around a low carb approach or a ketogenic approach for women. There is good reason. Well, there is research looking at sort of acute markers of bone health, and this is in both men and women. And it appears that a low carbohydrate diet might increase that bone turnover or bone breakdown. Bone is always turning over, but if you're not able to protect bone and have that sort of bone remodeling process protected, then there may be implications from a bone health perspective. But a lot of the research to date has just been on acute markers and not really sort of long-term effects. And we don't know whether an adaptation process needs to occur in order for these things to sort of be resolved or go back to normal. So I think some of that research just isn't there yet. Equally, to your point, culturally, and as I mentioned, like, women just can be in that restrictive mindset. And if you look at, and there probably isn't enough research looking at isocaloric diets that provide sufficient calories and what impact a ketogenic diet has versus a more standard approach, or even just a low carb diet, and what sort of health outcomes that these might have. Like, and there is some mechanistic trials looking at changing hormone levels. There's a particular hormone called kisspeptin, which appears to be, and that helps in the production of estrogen, that appears to be downregulated with a low carbohydrate diet. But again, we don't know. Well, there's animal data to say that, so it's a preclinical trial. We don't know what the long-term impact is of this in a human clinical trial. And then there are like changes in thyroid markers, and T3 can be reduced on a low carbohydrate diet for both men and women. And some people would say that, well, maybe our system is just sort of doesn't require as much T3 or active thyroid hormone, so it becomes sensitized to the action of it on a ketogenic diet, so you don't need as much. But there's not a lot of research in that athlete space at this point in time. So I would say it's pretty up in the air, actually. And if you fix energy availability and ensure you've got enough energy, what is the overall impact of a low carb diet? I mean, I don't know that we necessarily have that answer.
I'm excited to announce that I launched a new group coaching option. So, to go along with my personalized one-on-one coaching options and my pre-made plans that I have on my website at zachbitter.com, this year I'm starting a group of online endurance runners who want to work with me in a slightly different model. So if you're interested in checking that out, just head to my website at zachbitter.com, go to the coaching tab. From there, you'll be directed to the team coaching option, and you can sign up for that and get onboarded to join the group. Mhm. Yeah. So do you think like when people are talking about like or maybe advising against a low carb ketogenic diet for an athlete or for women in general, are they looking at it through kind of like a precautionary principle then where it's like, well, we just don't have the information to really guarantee that this isn't going to be a net negative in that department, so we should stay cautious and maybe avoid it until we do?
I think maybe, but also I think that you do see out there that a low carbohydrate diet is negative for females, but it's based on that low calorie diet literature. So I think there's just a miscommunication there. Um,
Mhm.
and yeah, so I think those are probably the major reasons why people are against it.
Yeah, yeah. And the other thing, like we kind of have two things kind of going on with the conversation between like the bone density stuff and then like female hormone stuff. But the bone density stuff's another one that I find interesting because if someone switches to like a low carbohydrate or a ketogenic diet, when I just think about like the foods that they're going to remove in order to achieve that,
Mm.
the first things that go are usually the stuff that are fortified, so it's like the cereals and
Yeah.
things like that, so it's like my question always is like, even with a calorie matched, what is the micronutrient shifts going on here, and how closely attention were they paying to that to make sure they weren't having some sort of deficit in a micronutrient that could potentially lead to, like, bone health issues and things like that too, so there are a lot of moving parts when you change a dietary macronutrient to that degree, and I think that's maybe just something where within the low carb ketogenic diet community, we need to talk about, hey, while you're shifting your macronutrients around, might not hurt to actually take a look and see what micros you're also shifting, and if it is something where you went into like a pretty low amount relative to what the RDAs would suggest, just search and see what low carb friendly foods you could maybe add into your protocol to kind of account for that, or be mindful of that when you're getting blood panels done and things like that to see if it's changing at all, if you have a reason to be concerned.
I completely agree, and it is interesting, isn't it? Because in fact, like if you think about a low carb approach, and you're increasing, potentially you're increasing protein, and you're increasing or you're increasing protein first with, and to some extent a little bit of dietary creatine, which can be helpful for bone. Ultimately, if I think about bone, like the things which are important are obviously calcium, and then you've got protein, then you've got things like boron and silica and vitamin D and magnesium and phosphorus, and then of course strength training is probably one of the most
Yeah.
important things for bone, and of which, as endurance athletes, if we're doing a lot of hill-based work and load-bearing work, plus doing strength training on top of that, there's a lot of real protective things happening with regards to bone health. And then if you remove a lot of the junk carbohydrate, you're likely reducing inflammation that is one of the worst things for bone as well. So I think there's a lot of I think I absolutely agree with you with regards to ensuring you've got your micronutrients set, and equally in a low carb approach, there's a real opportunity to enhance bone health. I don't know.
Mhm. Yeah, I wonder too sometimes when it comes to the implementation of things too, where I think we see a lot more, I would venture to guess, like fasting and time restricted
Mm.
feeding type approaches within the low carb ketogenic community. And I wonder sometimes how that sort of how that plays into just like bone turnover and some of these issues that we're maybe seeing as well. They're like, are is there any reason to believe that even with calorie matched with these larger windows of non-eating that it could negatively impact like the bone remodeling process or even the protein muscle synthesis to some degree?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. People, when we stop and look at the benefits of exercise and the benefits of fasting, they're very similar in terms of the hormone changes that occur and the upregulation of enzymes that help with, fat adaptation, but also anti-inflammatory pathways and antioxidant pathways. Like you almost couldn't differentiate between fasting and exercise, and sometimes the individual that is interested in their health and longevity and their training, they almost want it, they start layering these things on top of each other to the detriment. And then it just makes it incredibly difficult to actually get in the nutrition they need if they're only eating within a 6 hour window, and they're doing an early morning extended training session, and they're all doing it with health in mind. But a large part of it, I feel, Zach, is because a lot of the information is really valuable and really helpful for someone who may have metabolic issues and who might not train, who might be largely sedentary. And so that's where fasting, is a really great tool for someone like that. But it's just a little bit too much stress on the system of the endurance athlete, which, I mean, stress is super important, but we also need that sort of recovery to help build our resilience. Whereas you're not going to get that if you're fasting and training and doing all of the things.
Yeah, and that's how I'll usually kind of like lead in with fasting when someone asks me about that and they're doing endurance sport is just like when you think about it, just like if we remove the time as the measure and implement an energy expenditure instead, it's like if I were to do, say, a 24-hour fast and it be sedentary, it's like maybe I metabolize around 2,000 calories, give or take. But if I do that same thing, but have a 20-mile run in the middle of it all, it's like I've almost like I've definitely 2x'd that energy output. So then as far as like my metabolism is concerned, it's closer to 48 hours worth of sedentary non-eating. So when you kind of have these two different ways to measure that, and I always find it interesting where it's like you said, like, there's probably just gonna be a lot more stress involved when you're doing it with that highly active lifestyle, and you should be paying attention to also, like, how much energy have I likely gone through since I last ate, as
Mm.
much as you're thinking about some number on the clock.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I'm not sure how you feel about this, but there's just been such an explosion in that social media space of experts, and experts who are um, who end up speaking to the same people, even though their message is directed to completely different populations. But I feel like that gets a little bit lost. And I see this a lot in particularly the women's health space. You have people with very large platforms saying something which is really appropriate for one type of individual, but they're because their reach is so large, it's just like, everyone is hearing it. And so there's a lot of confusion because this person is super well qualified as much as this other person is, who their target audience is very different, but again they're all speaking
Yeah.
to that same everyone's talking to everyone basically, and people find
Mhm.
it hard to tease out what's actually relevant to them.
Yeah. I mean, I see the outcome of that all the time where someone will mention, like, "I've been told to do literally everything now," or not
Yeah,
do everything, so
yeah.
it is like that, if you take, like, a key piece of advice from, like, let's say 5, like, really big profile, like, health influencers, you may end up in a situation where if you followed all that advice, you would be eating nothing. So,
Totally.
like, or everything, depending on how you look at it, but, yeah, so it does get, I think, a little complicated online with that stuff. Um, the other thing I wanted to ask you about fasting too is, and I'll see this will come up too where it'll be like they'll be talking about usually about endurance athletes, but I think it could probably be applied to the general population as well, or fitness people at the very least, is just men versus women with fasting. Is there a
Mm.
reason to believe that, like, let's say, for example, we did the due diligence and determined, okay, fasting is a safe input for us to play around with. Is there going to be a variance in kind of the recommendation with that from men to women? Or is it kind of once you know you're getting what you need, this can be applied and it's the gender is less critical?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And often one of the arguments sort of posited for, fasting is quote unquote dangerous for women is to do with like cortisol levels in the morning. And, women already have higher cortisol than men. And therefore, it is, they're just going to pull that lever even more. And it's damaging to their metabolism and damaging to their hormones. This is one of the major sort of arguments. And, Zach, if you look at the literature around cortisol levels, like if anything, men tend to have higher cortisol levels than women. Women are more reactive than men in terms of to changing situations impacting on their cortisol levels. But actually, I don't even know that I could even say that, because I think one of the most my big takeaway from the cortisol literature, and I did a bit of a dive on this like a couple of months ago, is that it's really hard to measure cortisol and measure it accurately and have everything standardized so you are able to have confidence that what you're seeing is actually what's sort of going on. So I'm not sure that cortisol argument really is a valid one for why women shouldn't train fasted sort of versus men. And again, I wonder if this just comes down to the sort of the energy availability. Now, I have looked at a few studies looking at athletic populations like martial arts and female dancers actually, and both obviously not endurance, but they train several hours a day, and there were no negative outcomes when these populations did a 16-8 protocol, but they trained sort of within that large within the feeding window. And so maybe that's an option for people if they want to do it, which actually is quite different from your whether or not someone should train fasted or not. Ultimately, I do think it's individual and it depends on the outcomes. Like if you've got a 45-minute easy run and you just get up, you do your easy run, you come in, you shower, you have breakfast, I don't think that's a dangerous practice. However, if you get up and you go out for 2.5 hours and you have some intervals within that run, you come in, you shower, you have a black coffee, you go into a meeting or three, and then you're eating at 11, like, I don't think that would be good for anyone, to be honest, in terms of their recovery. So I feel like uh, there are ways to do things which are probably completely fine, and then may not be so helpful overall. Like I'm interested actually to know if what your experience is like with your clients and fasting versus not, and your female population.
Yeah. Yeah, it's I probably get less of that interest once I start when I'm work because I'm working with, like, a lot of ultra marathon runners where
Mm.
it just is one of those things where unless there's, like, a compelling reason to do it, like, we're just not gonna even put it in place, at
Yeah.
least not in a kind of its structure that you described. Because this is kind of like a topic that I was just gonna like comment on from what you said too is like there is a difference in the research from what I can tell in terms of how you actually structure like a 16/8, where I believe that it's got better outcomes when you actually do early
Mm.
or a later time restricted. So like actually having that 8 hour window be kind of breakfast through lunch versus
Yeah.
being like, okay, lunch at 1 p.m. is the first thing I ate since, last night's dinner, in which case you kind of have like what I would imagine to be kind of the more metabolically expensive phases of the day for a lot of people or the
Mm.
higher cortisol points of the day. And, you know, so a lot of times I think when I look at this, I'm looking at it as like the biggest thing I'm going to look at first is like when are you working out? So if someone is going to do some fasting or some time restricted eating, I'm usually thinking, well, are you doing your major training session first thing in the morning? If that's the case, then we want to be very careful around that, and we need
Yeah.
a kind of a compelling reason to justify it versus someone who's like, well, you know what, I know I go about my day and then I do my workout kind of mid afternoon or early evening or something like that. I'm a little less worried about it in that scenario because they wake up and they're having their lower metabolic phases of the day kind of in those that first half, and I think they're gonna probably be able to navigate that a little with a little less stress than they will when, like you said, their workouts are kind of more around that feeding period that they're doing. So, again, the context of that is a pretty big one, but I think, like, I don't get a lot of my low carb clients, I don't have a lot of them that are really that, like, compelled to fast outside of,
Mm.
like, what you said, where it's like, oh, I have like a rest day or I have this short 45-minute easy recovery day and I'm not hungry. So I'm just going to kind of like wake up and go and do this run because I'm not being driven to eat and things like that. And some of them will end up kind of in that space almost more like intuitively where they get to a point. It's rarely something where it'd be like like 16 hours off, but getting to 12 happens pretty naturally a lot of times I find with my low carb ketogenic clients where they're just not getting that same kind of pattern of hunger signals as they had when they were on moderate to high carbohydrate diets. So they sometimes just find themselves, I think, maybe getting busy on a less stressful day from a workout standpoint and finding that they're going 12 hours before they start getting that kind of drive to want to eat in the first place.
Yeah, and I think it matters in terms of the overall goal of the individual too. So, a lot of the clients I work with, they have their sort of training goals, but they also want to try and improve body composition as well. And so,
Mhm.
they are across a week, they'll be in a calorie deficit, but it will vary day to day depending on their training. For that individual, I'm always really careful to ensure that most training, if not all, is supported with nutrition because when you are like a lot of our intuition is, well, if I train fasted and then I'm reducing calories there and I'm burning more calories and I'm going to get more favorable outcomes in body composition. Whereas if you're in a calorie deficit and you're running low on calories anyway, to sort of get up and do a training session, you might not have the energy you need to get those fitness gains you want, and also you don't feel very good, and then you sort of feel like, well, that was a bit of a bum session, and it's not very motivating. Whereas I think protecting the training is really important for that calorie deficit client. And then, as you mentioned, just pulling some calories out later in the day, not a whole meal probably. Like I'm not I mean, personally, I like 3 meals a day. I haven't always been that way, but I've certainly moved that way over the last 3 or 4 years. And plus nutrition for training or a snack. But it's easier to sort of think about that if you train in the morning to have really good fuel around there, as you say, that metabolic output, and then think about what you're doing at dinner and can you make adjustments there to sort of shift calories down a little bit to help support that body composition change that they're looking for.
Hey folks, just a quick reminder that this podcast sponsors include S Fuels. They have a 15% offer for you. Element Electrolytes, they have a free sample pack offer for you. John G Apparel has 10% off, and Delta G Ketones has a 20% off and free consultation offer for you. Links and details can be found in the show notes and the episode landing page. You can also check out a full description of how I use all of these products in my own training and racing at the end of this podcast episode. Mhm. Yeah, and one thing I'll add to kind of your question too is, like, when I do have, like, kind of fasted training sessions and things like that, I think one of it is, like and this is where people I think sometimes just need to kind of, like, step back and kinda think, "Oh, this isn't necessarily an all or nothing proposition. This could be
Mm.
I do this sometimes, but not always,
Mm.
because I think a lot of the stress from those sort of things is, like, if you're 7 days a week, all year round, working within this tight window of feeding, that could compound on itself, especially when you have, like, the lifestyle of an endurance athlete where one day to the next maybe looks drastically different. But if I have a coaching client and we're just, like, interested in, like, "Hey, I wonder what your," like, I like to call it, like, a fat oxidation field test, where it's like, we might have some cool lab numbers, but let's see how this actually plays out in the field. And I want to send them out for a long run unfed with just water and electrolytes. And let's just see how your energy levels play out. Because if
Mm.
I have a coaching client who's been doing a low carbohydrate diet for a while and they're able to easily tolerate that, that's a good sign, because I mean, then I know I'm like, okay, you're not struggling to do this low intensity, longer session when hydration is accounted for and electrolytes are accounted for. And versus maybe what they experienced before if they had been on a moderate high carb diet, where, like, if they hadn't had like that pre-run breakfast and then a bunch of calories out there during it, they would have noticed a deterioration throughout. So there are some kind of signals that I do like to see in the field that I think reflect whether the application of our approach is working or not. But that's something we can do sporadically, just like I'm not going to give one of my clients a lactate threshold field test every week. I might give them one every 6 weeks or so just to see, like, were there improvements from the time we did it before and that, and then the inputs we gave you between then and now. But yeah, thinking of it less of a, like, this is like your reality going forward versus here's something we can kind of plug in occasionally and check some things and see some things and learn some stuff about how your body's working, but not necessarily get overly prescribed with it.
Yeah, no, I really like that. And we often forget that nutrition can be cycled the way training is. Like
Mhm.
there are times in a training cycle for an athlete where we know it's going to be mostly low intensity as they're building their aerobic sort of base. And that's a great time to potentially drop those carbohydrate calories out and try and get some sort of body composition improvements if that's what they're after, or just really sort of grease the groove in terms of increasing those endurance adaptations. But once you sort of hit into high intensity type work, or just training load and metabolic output goes up, then that's when it is really important to actually shift things in terms of nutrition. And that is a mistake I see a lot of athletes make, is they don't really think about adding in more calories for the higher energy output and supporting that work. Someone One of my friends, Brandon DeCruz, talks about metabolic flux and having this sort of higher metabolic flux. So you put the bunch of calories in and you actually get a lot more bang for your buck in terms of that workout. And it's just much better on the metabolism than always doing exactly the same thing. So yeah, we definitely have those conversations too.
Yeah. Yeah, that is an interesting point because I think that actually kind of weaves into just, like, what I would call, uh, the different kinda, like, carb timing side of things
Mm,
because, and we can maybe get into this topic a little bit more because we kinda started out with it where it's like someone who's on a strict ketogenic diet, they may have a little less wiggle room in terms of really moving much around because 'cause they're just gonna be keeping their carbs quite a bit lower. But someone who falls into that low carbohydrate category, you know, for those folks, I think a lot of people wanna look at it through the lens of, like, let's just plug in, like, X number of carbs per day and just rinse and repeat because it's a kind of a simple thing to look at on paper. But in reality, like, if I am or one of my clients who are doing low carbohydrate nutrition are in a phase of training where we're working on speed work development and we're doing a 2, maybe even 3 in some cases, moderate to higher intensity sessions during the week, And then because those training sessions tend to be higher training load, they're usually put on, separated with easy days or rest days, where I find those scenarios to be like, rather than just hitting the same amount of carbs every day, maybe we kind of bolster up some of those higher training load sessions with more carbohydrate than you would normally do. But then you have this easier kind of rest day afterwards where you can kind of bring them down below what you would normally average. And then over the course of multiple days, you kind of hit that range, but it's just kind of a little more like waves and troughs than it is just straight line across the board.
Yeah, completely. It makes me laugh, Zach, because I still hear people describe you as a zero carb athlete. And I'm like,
Yeah.
what? Like you are nothing of the type. And I think you illustrate in your training and how you work with your clients really well is that carb appropriate, carb timing sort of approach. You feel it's the right, what is it? Right fuel, right time, right? So it's
Mhm.
putting in the carbs when you need it and then sort of scaling back when you don't, which physiologically just makes a ton of a ton of sense. And what I do find with carbohydrate, the other thing which I think about is, if I'm working with a low carb athlete, male or female, but oftentimes it is female, and if we're thinking about around that perimenopausal time of life where estrogen tends to be sort of fluctuating wildly and can be a lot higher than usual, progesterone is sort of on its way out, then carbohydrate can become an important tool for some people, and putting it in their evening meal, which might seem, which is not the typical time that they expect to sort of have it, but it can really like offload a bit of stress on the central nervous system and help with sleep. And I notice this particularly in a lot of athletes. If you're sort of grinding it out in training and then in life, and you've got children or a household to take care of, and you might be looking after um, elder parents and things like that, then like life stress can play into their ability to recover from the training stress, and the training is what they're doing for themselves to try and stay well balanced, but things are sort of out of balance. And even in that low carb model, um, a lot of the time we're putting carbs in, post training, but also in the evening meal just to help with sleep, which is a really worthwhile tool, I think, in that particular athlete.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And that's actually one of the more interesting topics with low carbohydrate diets. And I'd be curious kind of if you have a protocol that you use, because I think one of the more interesting things for me when I first got into this was when I switched from a moderate to high carbohydrate diet to a lower carbohydrate diet, my sleep improved.
Yes.
And I've worked with, like, individuals where they've had the exact opposite experience, and I remember that was
Mhm.
one of the first things that I realized. So I started this long enough ago, like, I had such little, like, knowledge of the health space where it was like, to me at that point in my life, it was more like, "Oh, it worked for me, it'll probably work for you." And
Yeah.
then you start to realize through, like, seeing, like, just paying attention to other people and their stories about like, "Oh, maybe that's not the case." And that was one of the first ones that I learned that on was like, "Oh, there's other people who they actually have that reverse scenario." And I think it was, Dr. Ted Naiman I was talking to, and he mentioned, he's like, "Yeah, I've seen that a lot with my ketogenic clients." He's working with more or less active people, but still very much kind of leveraging, at least that portion of his client base was leveraging a ketogenic diet. And he said, yeah, when they have, trouble sleeping at night or falling asleep at night, we just move a little bit of their carbohydrate to the evening, and that helps kind of satisfy their liver glycogen, and then boom, they sleep just fine. And I've recommended that to people who've said that they've had that issue, like before throwing out the approach altogether. Maybe try this and see if it works.
Mm.
And a lot of times it does. So, yeah, have you seen anything like that too with, like, sleep issues and carb timing?
Yeah, I definitely have. And, because I work with a number of fat loss clients, both in and out of the athlete space, I wonder, like, in my experience, it's almost sort of 60-40 in that, 60% of people are probably actually fare okay. Like, you drop the carbohydrate out and they still tend to sleep all right. We can put other things in to help with sleep, like magnesium or inositol or glycine, or, some sort of supplemental support. Um, but some of them do not get any respite until we put carbohydrate back in. And as Dr. Ted Naiman sort of mentioned, like, it doesn't have to be a lot, but it just seems to be enough just to help. And I like that, he mentioned the restocking of liver glycogen, and my and I'm thinking about it from a different perspective, but just that offload of that stress, but same sort of outcome. And I also, the bit which I have to have a conversation with someone, and because they're a little bit fearful that they might sort of reverse some of the potential benefits that they've been experiencing, because suddenly they're putting more calories or more carbohydrate into their diet. But so it's having that conversation and reminding them that actually, outside of everything, getting adequate and sufficient restorative sleep will probably be,
Yeah.
worth so much more. Like, and so that's the thing that we focus on, and everything else will balance out after that.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, even just down to your appetite, if you're sleeping better, if you have a weight loss goal, getting good sleep is gonna certainly aid in that. And yeah, sometimes it's just a conversation too about like, well, let's just shift versus add or subtract, and then it can kind of be helpful with that for one reason or the other.
Mm.
Do do you have do you when you're looking at carb replacement, the other thing I'm always interested in is like the carb type. Because if we looked at that specific situation, if it were to be something where we wanna have liver glycogen be kind of the preferred spot for the carbohydrates they take in, are they gonna be better off with, like, a fructose, like, maybe some fruit with their dinner before bed or something like that in terms of, helping with that? Because, like, my understanding is, like, if you use, like, a fructose, that's more likely to go towards the liver versus, I don't know, a different carbohydrate source.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. That is how that sort of pathway works. Albeit, I've never thought about it like that. To be honest, Zach, I've thought more about it from, what's going to fill these people up a little bit more, what
Sure.
might provide a few more nutrients, and more fruit absolutely falls into actually both of those categories. Often, I think about dinner, and I'm like, well, if you have potato or sweet potato, then that is going to sort of um, you get a surprisingly small amount of carbohydrate for the volume of that particular
Mhm.
food. So that's generally what I go to. But that's an interesting concept with regards to thinking more about the fruit aspect of it and the fructose, because yes, that pathway absolutely exists. But I generally still
Yeah,
have
I
success.
yeah, I can't say I have, like, great, like, data from, like, my own coaching clients where I would say, like, "Oh, yeah, I have, like, everyone who's done fruit versus, something
Yeah.
else had better outcomes with it," but it seemed intuitively something that would
Mm,
maybe be or at least, like, a starting point if they're, like if they say 'cause I sometimes the folks I'm working with, they're very open to me giving them suggestions as to what to eat because they just kinda wanna be told what to do
oh,
and not have to
totally.
make that decision themselves, and then, like, so I'm like, "Well, if that's what we're trying to solve, let's just start here because this would probably be the best likely way for it to go. And then if that doesn't work, we can always try something different. But rather than giving them something different and then coming back and switching it, if that doesn't work, it just seemed to make more sense. But yeah, you're right. I think a lot of people who are just looking to reduce their carbohydrate intake, if you're swapping out things like rice, breads, cereals for things like potatoes and whole fruits, especially like melons, berries, and some of these like higher volume type fruits, you're probably especially if they're just eating intuitively, they're probably gonna
Mm.
reduce their carbohydrate intake just by the fact that they're not gonna eat nearly as much of it as they would otherwise.
Yeah, no, I agree, and sometimes, things get thrown under the bus where I feel it doesn't necessarily need to. Like, I feel like melon gets a bad rap because people talk about how high in sugar it is, but if you look at the amount that you actually have to eat to have like an
Mhm.
appreciable sort of response, and of course every individual is different, but you can like because it's so full of water, like you can tend to eat quite a bit without, and it's all about balance, right? Like, we very seldom eat food in isolation. It's usually in the matrix of a meal that might also contain fat and fiber and protein. So that in itself will change that blood sugar response to to a particular food. But it's very easy to get quite myopic or sort of insular when it comes to food and nutrition. Like we'd think about just one food or in one aspect, without actually thinking about how people actually eat, which generally is in a whole meal.
Yeah. Yeah, like the berries and melons, especially like cantaloupe type melons, those
Mm,
are like, yeah, a lot of water, a lot of fiber, not a lot of sugar actually when you think
mm,
about it. Now, if you
mm.
juice a bunch of them, that's a different story.
Yeah. Totally.
But yeah. So I did want to ask you a couple more maybe like female low carb questions
Mm,
too. Because you mentioned like maybe some carbohydrate support is useful during like perimenopausal times and things like that, or that stage. Is there any sort of like carb cycling that is worth kind of using as this is maybe a good place to start for women just within their cycle in general? Are there like different phases of that where they'd be more or less it'd be more or less advantageous for them to have more or less carbohydrate during those times?
yeah, it's a great question, Zach. And if you look at the state of where the research is now, there is no solid research to suggest that changing your nutrition is going to impact your cycle across a month. Uh, this is what the research tells
Mm,
us. But clinically speaking, I think there are a range of different ways which we can think about diet and how it can help improve symptoms around your cycle and potential energy issues. So if I think first about a woman in her reproductive years, and then I'll move into perimenopause because I feel like there's like challenge or differences there, is that if a woman experiences increased cravings or a bloating or pain and more tender breasts and a sore back and migraines and things like that, that that's a real sign to me that something needs to change in their usual diet, either in general across the board, or particularly at that time, maybe post ovulation and into that luteal phase where they are experiencing these symptoms. And sort of low hanging fruit that I see here are things like dairy is a big one, and particularly A1 dairy, which is a type of protein. It's the A1 casein protein in cow's dairy. It can sort of it can stimulate the release of these inflammatory cytokines for some women, not all. But if you do have like heavy periods, or you have a lot of noticeable symptoms, then removing dairy can, and to see what impact that might have and whether that helps resolve some of these challenges. And then of course if it does help improve symptoms regardless of what it is, then you're more able to train effectively and feel better and things like that. Sometimes bloating and is a real challenge and issue around the luteal phase, and following an approach that might be lower in uh, the FODMAP carbohydrates, which are these sort of types of carbohydrate foods which can create more inflammation and more digestive challenges. And these are like seemingly unrelated foods. Like anyone could Google FODMAP and you'd come up with a list of low, medium, and high. And for some women who experience issues around that, then removing those FODMAP containing foods across their luteal phase can make for a more comfortable experience. And then I find, some of the recommendations for carbohydrate in that luteal phase almost are counter to what I would think makes sense to me, because in luteal phase, some women, mechanistically, you're not able to access glycogen as readily. And so often the recommendation is to increase carbohydrate intake across that phase of the cycle, and particularly during training. Whereas I think maybe, in fact, you'd have a better outcome if you worked instead generally to get more fat adapted. So you relied less on glycogen, because oftentimes the types of carbohydrate you might take during training might just ramp those sugar cravings up even more that women also experience. So, I seem to approach that a little differently. And the other thing is that if you are wanting to improve body composition and you're following a calorie restricted approach, then during that luteal phase, if you have cravings, in fact, it makes sense clinically to actually just lift your calories back up to calorie maintenance across that time. So, because those cravings might only be enhanced if you're restricting calories. So these are just some changes and things I think about for women who menstruate every month and in their sort of reproductive years. But then as we shift into perimenopause, some of the changes that occur makes a woman more insulin resistant, actually. So, if I'm working with an athlete who historically has a higher carbohydrate approach, then for them, they might find that their blood sugars are harder to regulate and they fluctuate more regularly because of that shift in hormones and that change in that estrogen levels across a month. So I think if you're more insulin resistant, then it makes sense to moderate carbohydrate and drop them down, ensure that they're sort of working on fat adaptation techniques during training. So the calories that you have before training are more likely to be fat and protein and not carbohydrate. We put carbohydrate in post training, and lower that overall sort of carbohydrate load. Some of those other dietary shifts I mentioned with regards to symptoms around the menstrual period and the luteal phase, they can often help a woman in their perimenopause phase 2. And then just a real the thinking about alcohol intake and what that looks like, and thinking about other sort of diet habits which might not be serving them, like the fasting that we discussed, and like the sort of just under fueling during a day. These are all the conversations that I will have with a woman to help sort of optimize nutrition at that time.
Mhm. Well, that's excellent. Yeah, it's always fun to kind of like dive into some of the like particular context type stuff too, because it's so easy to want to get into that phase of, all right, this worked for this particular day or week or month, and therefore it must continue to work. But that's just not the way it happens to be. So you're always kind of solving some problems or adjusting and tweaking things. It seems to be able to find that spot that works well.
Yeah, for sure. And what I will say, Zach, is it's very rare do I come across a client whose protein is optimized to where I think it should be, and so and amongst all the conversations I have, most often I'm encouraging a woman to increase their protein intake, and because if I come across an athlete and they're like, well, I have a protein smoothie at breakfast, and I'm having a chicken salad at lunch, and then I'm having a steak at dinner, that still might only be half of the amount of protein that they actually need, but because they're having protein at each meal, they consider it a higher
Mhm.
protein diet. And encouraging, sometimes it's a challenge to encourage them to eat more, because the flow on effect is that it will change how they feel and how much they might be eating later on in the day. And often we forget, outside of our meal times, the times that we actually eat. Like, we almost never remember the time we pass the fridge and just grab something out of it, or
Yeah.
we're like just sort of standing in the kitchen after dinner or eating the food on our kids' plates. So it's looking at that sort of big picture and getting them to think about that. And most people who I encourage to eat more, almost all of them benefit from it, with regards to their appetite and their energy. But that's often a thing I have to have a conversation with women. And this is something which I also experienced a real shift in my appetite when because I've been at all extremes of diet across, the last 20 years. And particularly, when you get into low carb and you get into fasting, and then you realize it doesn't work for you, and you sort of shift back to this moderate approach, and then you change things up again. A lot of how I counsel people is based on my clients' experiences as much as my own experiences as well.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. So when you increase the protein intake with your clients, you find that they just tend to do a little less kind of like mindless snacking because they're just not motivated to maybe do it as much. Is that typically what happens with that?
Yeah, 100%. Like and I mean, there is good research to show as well that increasing morning protein decreases late night snacking. And it also changes their relationship with alcohol, Zach, which
Mm,
is super interesting. And this is not the topic we're talking about today, but I know from the GLP-1 agonist data, you see, an increase in GLP-1 can change someone's relationship with alcohol. Like shifting in protein levels can do the same. Like often women well, not often, but sometimes someone comes to me and they're a little bit concerned that they feel they really need that glass of wine at the end of the day to unwind and things like that. But actually, when we correct what goes on at the start of the day, they're just far less motivated to sort of jump into the wine. It's less of a craving and a desire. And so increasing that protein can go a long way to fixing a lot of what some of these diet challenges that people experience.
mhm. Yeah. Yeah, that is really interesting. I know, like, I've done it's been a while, but I've done a lot of podcasts in the past where we talked to kind of like protein and its role in the diet and the recommendations and things like that, and it seemed like, a lot of the big names in protein research and on the academic side, not just the online influencers, are saying that, like, we could probably afford to shift that up a bit in terms of what we would like to see people getting on a daily basis. So I would be curious, are you targeting like a specific amount of protein that you're trying to get your clients to try to hit for each day in order to kind of get some of those effects that you mentioned?
Yeah, I try to get them to, depending on where they're starting from, my sort of goal for them is, 2 grams per kg body weight as a target. Some people fare really great on more, and I'm not sure if you've seen, but Professor Jose Antonio has a couple of case studies where a couple of his endurance athletes have pushed them to like 3 grams per kg body weight,
Mm,
and seen really good benefits. But that sort of starting point of 2 grams per kg body weight. And then for my clients who are over the age of say 40 or 45, I'm really trying to hit breakfast as a big as a time to sort of get 40 to 50 grams of protein in. And there's no definitive age that you can see in the literature where this occurs, but what we know is that the older we get, just the more of a signal that the brain needs from the amino acids that protein provides to be able to initiate that muscle protein synthetic response. And if you
mhm,
don't have that protein or hit that threshold, then you're not going to be able to get to initiate that full response. And therefore, that you're not going to get that repair and rebuild of muscle to the same extent. So I generally say, sort of, if you're over the age of 40, then, and in addition, you have some of these other symptoms of, for example, perimenopause, where we know that we can get some really good benefits from having protein early, then I'm going to make sure that you're getting 40 grams in your breakfast at least. And then in your evening meal, we're going to also try and hit that sort of 40 to 50 grams. And then the rest of the day, there's less research actually, Zach, on how much protein we need at lunch specifically, but we just try to pick up those other protein grams that are required to meet their overall sort of total protein intake. And I think people often get a little bit confused, probably not the listeners of your show, because they're probably quite onto it, but sometimes people think 40 grams of protein is the same as 40 grams of meat. And it's
mm,
quite different, and this is also a conversation I have. Like, so if you're hitting 2 eggs in the morning for breakfast, that's 15 grams of protein. And so you're going to need to be a bit more considered around, around what you're having. And it can be absolutely be done and easily once you get into the habit of having it. But these are some of the differences that, or the things which I get my clients to sort of work on. And I've been doing it myself for a couple of years, and I forget actually that it can be really challenging to hit your protein target if you're not used to eating it. So we talk through a range of different things they can do to help sort of to help ease the process, if you like. Equally, though, I do try to meet a client where they're at. So even if at the bare minimum we're making sure they're getting 100 grams across a day, even if that's lower than their actual per kilogram sort of target, then I think that's a really good start.
Mhm. Yeah, and I like that. I mean, I'll usually for myself anyway, I'll usually target about a gram per pound, which is about 2
Mm,
per, kilogram. It's a little bit above that, but pretty
yeah.
close. And what I find useful with that is, like, if I'm targeting that, I'm probably at I mean, I guess I should maybe have, Jose Antonio back on the podcast to talk to him about his case studies, but,
Yeah.
my assumption with that is, like, I'm probably kind of near the top end of what I would likely need with that sort of an input, and then if I do fall a little short, it's probably not of consequence the way it would be if I were kind of, like, hanging around the bottom end of what was required and
Yes.
then making a mistake and getting less than that.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And when I spoke to Jose, he raised such a good point in that, we're as endurance athletes, we're just breaking down muscle tissue in our training, and we need that
Mhm,
substrate there to be able to repair and rebuild. And so for these particular athletes, they were quite light as well, so that absolute amount of protein probably wasn't more than 150 or 160 grams in a day,
mhm,
which is quite different if you're working with an athlete who might be, say, 85 kilos. Like, that's a significantly higher amount of protein, and for them it's probably not as important. And I agree with to your point that if you are sort of trying to hit a higher target, if you fall a little short, it's way less important than if you are sort of always on that sort of lower end of the threshold. And vegetarians are another uh, a group just to be mindful of as well. So for them, it is actually, to my mind, important that they try and set quite a high target and just hit it, because the bioavailable amino acids, or the bioavailability of those amino acids, are reduced, particularly for people who are exclusively plant based. Not so if you're eating things like eggs and yogurt and cheese, for example. But um, having hitting that actual target, I think, is really important. And if you struggle there, then maybe adding an essential amino acid powder alongside a meal to help sort of boost that amino acid profile of that meal is a good strategy to just try to sort of protect that protein threshold amount. That's some of the other conversations I'll have with my athletes.
mhm. Yeah. Yeah, that is interesting. I know I like some of the, like, vegetarians and vegans that I follow, I would say, like, over the last decade or so, they have very at least maybe I'm just following ones that have picked up on this trend, but I see them being a lot more vocal within their kind of group saying, like, get the high amount of protein and, like, go above and beyond what maybe your omnivorous or carnivorous friend is doing because it's gonna be in your best interest with, the bioavailability side of things versus I think it used to be something where I would see that group of people almost try to defend low protein diets because
Mm.
it was just more likely to be the outcome if you just intuitively have a vegetarian vegan diet that maybe you're sitting a little lower than normal. And I think they've learned to troubleshoot versus kind of try to lean into something that was likely a problematic thing for their community, which I think is great.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think it's interesting actually listening to Dom D'Agostino talk. This is sort of a bit of a side tangent from the vegetarian group, but potentially the population that might get away with a little less protein might actually be the ketogenic population, where he's mentioned before the possibility of just enhanced signaling from those amino acids in that ketogenic space. And to be honest, I don't know more about it than that, so I'd be interested to know a little bit more about that. But it is interesting, right? Like, you can really change, I suppose, your requirements based on these different sort of inputs that sort of go in.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, you're right about that. I don't know what ended up coming out of that, if there was any sort of, like, conclusion there, but I do remember a conversation being had about, like, and this would be strict ketogenic diets where they're on, like, a 4-to-1 fat to protein ratio, which sorta has the similar effect of, like, the plant-based, vegan, vegetarian diets where like when you start looking at someone who's not super active and their intake is maybe a little bit lower, or they're just getting a very high satiety signal from the ketogenic diet, you have a 4-to-1 ratio. You're such high in fat there, since there's 9 kilocalories for fat and only 4
Mm.
for protein, where you can be sitting down near the bottom end of that, protein recommendation or below without maybe knowing it or really thinking you are. And yeah, so it would be good to know for that group of people if there's a protective measure with a ketogenic diet towards how that protein's getting utilized. But yeah, I can't say if there was ever anything that came out that said like, "Yeah, that is likely the case," or "Don't count on it. Get your protein in."
Yeah, and maybe it just means that you need to have Dom back on your show at some point, Zach, and,
Exactly, yeah.
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
getting a great guest list from this interview. Yeah. Awesome. Awesome. Well, Mickey, it's been fun chatting. I think we definitely have to do another round down the road and just chat about all things low carb endurance and things like that. I'm sure there's plenty of other topics we could revisit or dive into that are different from what we talked about today.
Yeah, awesome, Zach. Thank you so much. And I have to say, I always really love listening to your podcast, and you have some amazing people on with lots of different perspectives. And I feel like you bring a real balanced tone to the low carb space, because you're very agnostic, actually, with regards to how you feel about diet. You're just sort of interested in getting information out there, which as a listener of your show, I'm always really appreciative of. So, and I'm honored to also be a guest on your show. So, thank you.
Well, I really appreciate that. But before I let you go, if you could let the listeners know where they can find you, because I know you find yourself recording podcasts from time to time and you're active on social media and a lot of your content is great. So it would be awesome for them to be able to check in and see what you're up to.
Yeah, well, thank you, Zach. So I you'll find me on Instagram at Mikki Williden, which is just my name. Similarly on X and on Threads and Facebook at Mikki Williden Nutrition. I have a podcast myself called Wikipedia, and to the likes of Zach, you've been a guest on my show very early on, and I'm also interested in exploring the concepts that we discussed today and just the broader health, longevity, fitness space I find fascinating. And my website is mikkiwilliden.com. So thank you so much.
Perfect. And I'll have all that in the show notes and the landing page as well so people can go click over and check out what you're up to. But yeah, appreciate your time.
Nice. Thanks, Zach.
Here are some discounts and promos for HPO sponsors. S Fuels, if you're interested in right fuel at right time approach, check out their second generation products that just launched. You can get a 15% discount by heading to their site. Also, if you want to try a free sample pack for the cost of shipping, there is a link in the show notes and on the episode landing page that will get you access to that. Otherwise, head over to sfuelsgolonger.com. Janji Apparel has 10% off with promo code BITTER10. Janji makes some great training apparel. I use it in the gym and on runs. You also have a really cool product I've been using a lot lately, which is their multi-pass mini and sling bag. I would definitely recommend checking those out. Element Electrolytes has a free sample pack with a purchase of their product and a satisfaction guarantee, which just means if you don't like it, you get your money back, no questions asked. You don't even have to return the product. They also just launched a new product called Sparkle, which is a 16-ounce carbonated can with the element flavors in it. This one's great. I've been using it in my long runs recently. Delta G Ketones has 20% off with promo code BITTER20, and they also offer a free consultation to help you better understand how their product would maybe fit your lifestyle and figure out what protocol would be best with that. So head over to deltagketones.com to check out their products and access that discount. Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast with Zach Bitter.